I'm Peter George and I'm the Strategic Director of Economy and Sustainability at Ealing Council.
From Ackroyd Lowry, I'm Oliver Lowry.
And I'm John Ackroyd.
And this is Urban Forecast, a show where we talk to the people defining the future of our cities. We discuss their background, what drives them, and the insights they've learned along the way.
This is a podcast for anyone who's interested in how we live, work or play in the cities of the future and what that means for the built environment today.
So Peter, thank you so much for coming in. And as with all of our guests, we like to start at the start. So it would be really interesting if you could give us a bit of a story of your journey through from training. I think actually we were at university at the same time in Sheffield, and what drew you towards sort of urban design regeneration and your roles from Hackney onto what you're doing now at Ealing.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So when I left university, I did my undergrad at Sheffield in history and politics. I knew I wanted to work in the public sector, but I didn't know which part. So I tried various jobs, which I wasn't very good at, wasn't particularly enjoying, until I landed a job as a researcher on the Woodbury Down Regeneration Programme in Manor House for Hackney Council. And that's a large kind of 5,000 home estate regeneration programme. So my role grew, really enjoyed it. And then 5 years in, I was given the opportunity to move to Enfield. And I should say during the time, and very much appreciate the investment in me I received from Hackney Council, is they sponsored me to do a master's in urban regeneration at the Bartlett at UCL. And something I've been talking about recently at Ealing is having a really strong emphasis on learning and development so that others are given the same opportunity to which I benefited from when I was in my 20s. So at Enfield, I joined because I was given the opportunity to lead on a smaller estate regeneration project, but I would have the opportunity to lead on it from kind of start to, and I really wanted to have full life cycle experience. And that went well. 120 homes, a health centre, community centre and some retail. And during the midst of that project, I appointed my very first firm of architects, which is a practice familiar to many, Hawkins Brown. I then moved on to leading larger estate regeneration projects up until about 8 years ago, when I was promoted into leading Meridian Water, which is a large £6 billion, 10,000 homes, 6,000 job programme. So I led that from inception for 8 years. But during that 8 years, I've operated within the council at a director level, and I led different service areas. So Meridian Water was the constant, but I also led the planning department, property department, regen, urban design, economic development and other services. Really enjoying myself, really enjoying the role. But then I was approached by a recruitment consultant unexpectedly. I wasn't really thinking about leaving, and it presented me with a couple of jobs. I said, I'm not interested, I'm happy. But then I reflected further on the Ealing opportunity. And I think it was a combination of the fact that I knew and liked the chief exec there, Tony Clements. I liked the fact that he was very boldly creating a brand new management team. Felt really fresh and exciting. And the remit and the ambition of the council and the vision in the council plan was really inspiring. And I also spent a lot of time walking around the borough, and I think the combination of all those resulted in me deciding to apply. And after 11 weeks, 6 interviews, I was thankfully successful. In my new remit, I feel sits really well with my experience. So I'm responsible for all housing delivery in the borough and estate regeneration. We've got a really ambitious agenda, wanting me to deliver 4,000 genuinely affordable housing starts over the next 3 years, deliver 10,000 jobs. They want the whole borough to be carbon neutral by the end of the decade. So in addition to all that, I'm responsible for kind of economic development, culture, parks, libraries, capital programmes, delivering new leisure, delivering a new regional park and the library. So it's a really big kind of built environment focused, place orientated role. But I think the other reason why I applied, and this is really important to me, is I got a strong sense from everything I read and during the process that the council shared my values. And for example, I was really impressed that equality and diversity was a thread throughout all of the interview stages, and even including having a dedicated 45-minute interview simply on equality and diversity, which I was really impressed by. And 7 weeks into the job, loving it. The really inspirational leader, some really ambitious and thoughtful cabinet members, a strategic chief exec, and all the colleagues and my team are not only nice and kind people, but they're really talented and motivated. So definitely the right choice.
Yeah, and I was reading all of the departments that are effectively under you. It seems like there's two things that strike me in the roles that you've had. The first is that you must have an amazing ability to have a sort of helicopter view of things, given the amount of different, the fact you've got regen, estate regen, parks, sustainability. Like, how are you able to zoom in and zoom out? Is it, I suppose when you're building your team now, you can bring in good soldiers to make sure that they're responsible. But when you're in the past, have you found that it's hard to drag yourself up out of the kind of day to day to focus on the bigger picture?
I think over time, I've naturally moved into a space where I take more of a kind of strategic and holistic view. And whilst, as my team will testify, I'm very much capable of stepping down into the detail, I try to avoid that temptation because I want to empower my management team and the team below them to deliver. But I get really motivated and excited by the kind of the big picture stuff, and I'm now really thinking about kind of what's Ealing's role within London. I think it's got a fantastic opportunity to make a real difference in London and that West London region. A good example being one of our ambitions, which I'm really excited about, is we want Ealing to be the foremost West London borough for culture. And something I've been speaking about a bit recently is London has lost, for example, a large number of our live music venues. And we've also been losing kind of cultural spaces for the LGBTQ plus community. So some of the conversations that we're having is what's Ealing's role in addressing London's declining cultural base, and looking at London as a whole. I think generally that the west of London is carrying a cultural and creative industries deficit in comparison to East London, other parts of London. And actually, I think the positioning and the geography of Ealing makes it perfectly suited to respond to that deficit. And we've already got Park Royal as a creative enterprise zone, for example, which is as part of the biggest regen projects in the country, the Old Oak Common. But we're also thinking about other opportunities where we can create new cultural spaces.
So that Meridian Water must have been an excellent sort of vehicle for having to exercise that skill that you're talking about, setting a very big vision. The scale of that single development is enormous. And what were the key, when you set out in that role, whatever, 10 years ago, what were the key sort of North Stars that you were aiming for? And do you feel on reflection that what you ended up with managed to hit those?
I think firstly, what I'll say to that is, I am a Londoner. I grew up in East London, and I make it my business to know London and observe how London is evolving and changing over time. With Meridian Water, I'd kind of always adopted a very strong kind of vision, obviously working within a larger vision set by the two leaders that I served under on Meridian Water, as well as the respective chief executives, etc. Within that context, I always have a very clear sense of the type of place that it should be. And for example, I took the view very early on that looking at the kind of the immediate geographic context, that it needed to be incredibly mixed use. That the context there is either side, east and west, is incredibly residential, and north and south is very industrial. So it's not a place in London that is going to attract any natural footfall, particularly now the IKEA store is shut. Yeah. So it's going to be that part of London, that site has got to be able to generate its own vibrancy.
Yeah.
And one way to drive that is through mixed use. But I think having a very clear vision and being very focused and at times quite stubborn about how that vision is delivered and implemented is really important. And I think I'm just really glad that I never would have left the project if I felt that it was in a bad shape, but I was really pleased with the progress that was made. But also I was really pleased that there's an incredibly talented team heading up Meridian Water under Sarah Carey and other people at Meridian Water.
So you mentioned that you first appointed an architect in that role at Enfield. You must have now appointed many of them. What's been your experience as not an architect, working with lots of architects, and then recently giving a talk at the RIBA?
Firstly, I really enjoy the company of architects. They're good fun. I take enjoyment in learning and observing all your architectural cliques. I love the fact that certain architects won't work with other architects because they're quite snobbish and precious. So I love all that. I find that quite amusing. But I think also I have real respect for the profession. At its best, the architectural profession, more than any other in a built environment, can have an incredibly positive impact on place.
I would agree with you, like in another era, as an architect, I would say that we are not we are down the importance rung from, I would say, developers, planners, local authorities. Like sometimes it can feel as an architect like you're window dressing.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing, because I think that's the way that the profession has evolved. Yeah. In a negative sense. Yeah. And actually, you setting the vision for Meridian Water probably have a greater say by a long way than any of the architects.
So I think there's a few things there. So I think firstly, what I meant by that comment was in relation to all of the other consultants within the built environment.
Yes. Okay.
So I think within that context, the architects have the greatest ability to impact place, and compared to, for example, engineers or the surveyors or the project managers. I think as you're taking a step back and looking at all of the actors and players who deliver developments and change within the built environment, I think what you say is true. And one of the things I always find really amusing is when I've have real life meeting with architects, and there's a developer client in the room, and the developer client's given a direction that the architect doesn't agree with. Not all of you have poker faces. And
I think I'm one of those.
I can read what the facial expression is saying. And what the facial expression is saying is, how the heck did I end up in this place where I've studied for 7 years, I've got all of this, amassed all of this knowledge, qualification and accreditation, and then I'm being told what to do by somebody that ultimately knows less than me and I don't really respect. That's certainly the vibe that some architects give off, which again I find quite amusing.
Hopefully at that point the clients can't see. It's only you that can.
Yeah, perhaps not everyone's reading the face. I certainly see that. Whether this is a new thing, I would imagine the client's ultimately always been the client in terms of being able to give the direction. Perhaps the architectural influence has waned over years. I would say,
I think it's like the market, the sort of the value of land in the UK. I think if you were in the 60s, 70s, you look at developments now in the city, you're like, bloody hell, why did they do four stories there? Now people are like, and maybe it's because it's more feasible, but it seems that the thing that the architect is often wrestling with is simply how to get a quantum on a site to make it viable to develop. And that this year is particularly bad for that, because there's a lot of projects that are simply either not going to be viable or they're going to have to be pushed and squeezed. And that, I think, is the bit that feels the most frustrating. But I would imagine it feels exactly as frustrating from your perspective as well, working with developers, where what they are requiring for you to allow to happen isn't acceptable to you, but otherwise they're saying that's fine, it will remain as it is, as a whatever it is, empty low-rise industrial shed. So I'm sure we share that frustration.
Yeah, the last year or two has been a very challenging time. Yeah, and it has been really difficult to get developments to proceed. There's been an accumulation of hostile headwinds, inflationary pressures, double staircasing issues, the fact that the housing association industry, a number of them are having to scale back their development pipeline to focus on fire safety, cladding, mould, retrofit, within the wider context of a struggling economy, and of course following that disastrous budget, spiralling interest costs. So it has been and remains quite a challenging environment. I take the view, though, that we're always going to have recessionary periods. And I think the public-private partnerships really prove themselves during the more difficult times rather than the rosier, easier times. And I'm having a number of discussions with partners in Ealing, with both my region hat on and the planning hat on, seeing how we can continue to work together to keep developments moving forward, even in these difficult times, because there's still very much a housing crisis, particularly in London. So therefore, it's incumbent upon us and the public sector to continue to deliver particularly affordable homes.
And I think that is that was the second part of the question that I forgot to ask the second half of, which is that I think, your role in the way that you've had to put together these sort of partnerships, how much of your role ends up being political versus you've got these three constraints? You've got commercial interests, then you've got your role as a sort of local authority, public servant, and then you've got this other role which is almost political. Do you have to straddle between all three, or do you find yourself more on the side of public servant?
As I said, my undergraduate history and politics, I enjoy politics, and I feel like I understand that. Yeah, it's not the role of a council officer to be political. It's the role of the council officer to be politically neutral, but to deliver upon the strategy and vision of the political administration. And at the moment in Ealing, there's a very strong Labour administration, strong in terms of the number of councillors they've got in relation to the others. So I don't view myself being in that political space. It's more that I've got, in the council plan, I've got a clear kind of agenda that I've got to implement on behalf of that political administration.
The other point that I wanted to ask you in terms of the conflicting elements of your role, I've read your RIBA speech a couple of times. I think you're very emphatic about the importance of sustainability in architecture, in regeneration, but your role also covers the economic side. And I wonder, when you're setting your vision now, how is it that, and I'm not saying that you can't, but how is it that you think you are going to make economic and sustainability requirements work together?
Yeah, it is a challenging one. What does sustainable growth look like? And how do you realise that, particularly where that growth necessitates changes to the built environment? Some of the things that we're already doing within Ealing is to promote a very strong retrofit first agenda, which we've now emphasised through the planning system. New applicants are going to have to demonstrate far more robustly before we accept any demolition, but before we accept that, the stage 2 of the sequential test will be reuse of materials. And as I say in my speech, I feel like that is a part of the industry which needs far more attention, and I haven't seen many good examples of that happening. So I think in looking at it through the lens of the built environment, I think one of the challenges is how we can facilitate growth within the kind of the building envelopes that already exist, and where new is needed, how we can design and build more sustainably. And that is particularly challenging in this unviable times. Yeah. But that isn't a reason for us not to continue to strive for it. And as I say in my speech, we shouldn't wait to begin implementing what we already know is right by having to wait to be regulated and told what to do. We should be taking a stronger view and lead. And I feel that all the architects I've met are incredibly climate conscious, and it's something that they generally really care about and are passionate about. And what my speech was actually saying to them is whether there's more they can do to manage up with their clients. Yeah. And I fully appreciate that that is a classic challenge and tension for the architectural industry. How do you effectively manage up to shift and persuade your clients to make better decisions? But I do see that as the role of the architectural profession.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're trying to do is we think that mostly planners and architects agree. And then this sounds terrible if clients are watching, but often we are in agreement about what the important things are in a scheme. It's placemaking, sustainability, and like quality of place. And then that doesn't always align with the view of a developer who has to make the site static, but mostly we agree. And so we do this breakfast club where we try and bring together planners for people that work in local authorities and a few politicians, but it's mostly actually for people like in roles like yourself, because we think that there's a lot of time, even when you are having these discussions, the developers will agree in the abstract. And there's not enough, I don't think enough time is spent discussing this with planners in situations that are outside pre-application. Mostly you have your discussions with the planner about a particular scheme, and it's in an hour-long slot. And I think you mentioned on another LinkedIn post, mostly now on Zoom, so you can't even really look into the person's eyes and get an understanding of them. And it tends to be that you focus on the bits that you disagree on. Yeah. But actually, when we do this breakfast club, you find that architects, developers, planners, and politicians mostly all agree about what we think the right things are, and that's good. So what we think is, if as architects, what we have to do is act as a bit of a translator, because if we can make sure that we're interpreting what planners are saying correctly, and what local authorities want and politicians want, and then we can take a developer on a journey, because we say, look, this is the scheme that we think ticks all these boxes, and therefore you can get more value out of that scheme because it's ticking so many boxes. That's the way to educate your clients, we believe.
But I think that last bit is the important bit, is demonstrating and applying the creativity of thought to be able to demonstrate that sustainability and viability can be aligned and are not incompatible. And there are some good examples that demonstrate that more sustainable developments can attract a high premium.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just on the end values, but I think if you can put together a good planning argument where sustainability is promoted, that there can be a bit of backwards and forwards with the planners on allowing other things that will make the scheme more viable. Those are the best discussions when you're trying to work together. And I think that's the main thing that strikes me about your role, is it's about partnership and trying to get to a win-win situation. Yeah,
that's right. And the post you're alluding to earlier that I mentioned on LinkedIn recently is we've adopted within our planning team what we've called a presumption in favour of real life meetings for all planning applications that require a planning performance agreement, which is not to say that there won't be any Zoom meetings or hybrid meetings, but you cannot deliver effective planning and kind of scheme development and design without multidisciplinary collaboration. And whilst I think one of the reflections that many of us are having post-pandemic is real life collaboration is more effective than online collaboration, and things like eye contact and body language, they do matter, and they do help you to read your clients or your partners and your collaborators. Whilst I very much advocate a hybrid approach, and I've said to the team that I lead, it's about 350, 400 people, I said that I expect you in a couple of days a week, but I have said every Thursday is our day, and I expect the whole of the directorate in on the same floor so they can start collaborating far more. But I've had some people who have not returned back to the office since the pandemic.
Case in point, as architects, it didn't take us very long after we were allowed to use, basically, this office is a carrot. So we spent a lot of time and money making this a place that people want to come to, because I think that's important. I think you have to now you have to encourage people back in rather than making them come back in. But we also do have policies that say certain times you have to be in, and that is because we don't think that it's effective to design and work as a team in isolation from one another. And when you're delivering a project with planners, with developers, with architects, same thing goes. You're trying to do it remotely. You need moments where you all come together with a big roll of tracing paper and spitball ideas.
I think it's particularly true in your profession. So many architects have said to me that they've actually taken a harder line than I have. I've said 2 days a week. Some of them are taking a more of a 4-day a week because they're convinced that you can't do good architecture with everyone kind of behind the screen. But I think I agree with the point about the office as well. So some of your listeners would have seen that within the last few weeks, Ealing Council's taken the bold decision to shelf plans to demolish and rebuild our council premises. And we decided to alternatively retain a retrofit, which I'm really proud that the council's taken that decision, particularly from a climate change perspective. And we're in the process of consulting staff on their views on what they're going to need from the office going forward. And the big question being the amount of space for individual workstations versus collaboration. But I referenced this in the speech, and I've had loads of architects contact me and said, please, can you consider us? So what I'm now thinking about doing, which I haven't mentioned publicly before, is to organise an architectural design competition for architects who are keen to be our preferred architects to carry out the designs of our building. So it'll be mostly internal design, but I anticipate that there'll be some external design work that will need to take place. But we've got an exciting vision for the council's building, not only to serve the needs of the council offices, but the leader himself is really keen on part of the space being for the local community, as well as part of the space being for business. So actually, we're going to create a vision around a really mixed use council building. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity for architects and designers. It is a
fantastic opportunity, and it segues very nicely into the point I think that we initially connected on, which is this industry needs to sort itself out. The last guest I had, the podcast going live next week, was Kunle Barker, who wrote a really good article in the AJ about how economic inclusion is the solution to diversity. And architecture, I think this, paraphrasing your points, architecture is an elite hobby in the way that it regards itself. And there's fights to the bottom around fees mean that people aren't paid well enough to really consider it as a job. And we have first-hand experience of that. It's a profession where it's hard to make enough money to really support as you were talking about, bringing people up and into the industry. And I have to say, I think architectural competitions are part of the problem. Given your speech and your passionate plea for the profession to sort of look after itself, I think it's kind of what you were saying. Don't do a competition that means that people will, or don't do an open entry one at least. Select it down, make it so that it's like a first stage, it's not too much resource, so people can apply easily, and then pick the ones to do a design competition, and maybe put some money into it to pay them, because
all of that
the industry kills itself all the time.
Yeah, all of that's been considered, and actually, I think firstly, the idea for an architecture industry it's not my idea. Was from a good friend of mine who is an architect. Yeah, he suggested it.
Oh, we love killing ourselves. It's our favourite thing.
Yeah. But then, to be fair, I then bounced it off another architect who helped me refine the idea, and he actually said exactly what you're alluding to, which is make stage 1 week, Peter. 1 week to knock out. Everyone's got the same opportunity. Knock out a sketch or so in a few days, very little resource, time investment, whittle it down to a small number, contemplate whether or not you want to pay them for that final stage, and then get into more detail in the process. So, I've been, and actually somebody else has contacted me on LinkedIn who's done a lot of work and research in how to design architectural competitions so that they're not discriminatory and unfair. So I'm going to take that particular person up. So I get what you're saying, and it is something that we're conscious of. But I think more generally, I think what's sad is the architectural profession has suffered a loss of stature over the last 2 decades. It used to command a comparable place to like being a lawyer or being a doctor. But where those salaries have kept a pace with inflation or exceeded it even, the architectural salaries have stagnated, whilst the architectural student fees have increased to the extent that it's no longer viable for those with less financial means to access the industry. And the point I'm making in my speech here, when you think about kind of intersectionality, there is a strong correlation between those with less economic means and other protected characteristics. So until the salary issue is resolved, I argue that RIBA should reintroduce fee guidance. Until that's resolved, I think the industry is always going to have a diversity problem. And I think the other point I would make is there's also very much a monopoly within the architectural profession. The profession is dominated by a small number of large architectural practices, invariably led by white men, who muscle out all other architectural practices for their own gain. And I've even seen it where I've appointed architects in the past, insisted that they appoint smaller or more diverse practices under them. They said they said all the right things, but when it actually comes down to it, they constantly try and muscle off the smaller practices for their own gain. I gave an interview yesterday to a publication, but a journalist, she was asking me, since I did my interview with AJ 3 years ago, where I criticised architectural profession in diversity, has anything changed? And I said, I think the public sector's improving its position. Architectural frameworks led by the likes of GLA and Southwark have responded to the diversity challenge.
I think Southwark only did it on the second time round. I think the initial list was...
That is correct.
And they've got about 300 architects on it.
Yeah.
There was a lot of effort to get on that framework, and I feel like once you've got a framework of 300, that's not really a framework.
That is a good point. And actually, what the journalist asked me is, she goes, what do I think about the frameworks? And I said to her, you can only evaluate the success of the frameworks over time, because a lot of practices have said to me that they sometimes feel that almost duped into applying for these frameworks and these processes, a lot of time and investment. And that time and investment is...
Most of them are incredibly exclusionary as well, but just in terms of practice size. They'll simply go, okay, show me the last 150 unit housing association building or local authority building that you've delivered. You're like, I haven't. Okay, that's question one done. We give up.
Yeah. It is difficult for what I would say in balance for local authority when we're leading.
I'm talking more HAs actually than local authorities. I think
Even local authorities or housing associations, we still need to balance off risk. We've got to weigh up new entrants with experience, which is why in the past I've tended to put together consortiums that have been involved with kind of large practices leading and the less experienced supporting. But what I've sought to do in the past, and I think this has got to be more robust, is having specific roles and fee allocations for the smaller practices, because otherwise the larger practices do just gobble up all of the work. And swinging back round to what I was saying to that architectural journalist, the reason why things are having fundamentally changed over the last 3 years is it's because it's not in the interest of those small number of large practices to promote change, because change will be to their own financial detriment.
If you had to give recommendations to the RIBA, I know I would certainly have a few. I know you've got fee scales, which I totally agree with. Is there anything? I'm actually personally not a member of the RIBA because for me, it doesn't do the things that I would want to pay 450 quid a year to be advocated for. Could you give them a couple of other recommendations of how they should seek to try and improve the profession? Because it needs saving from itself. Architects, we love the work, we want to design things, we want to build things, but that's our downfall, is that we're so desperate to do that it ends up people killing themselves and just to work, not making any money.
So I think a few things. I think firstly, after I delivered a speech and went back into the room after the award ceremony, every architect I spoke to was firstly really positive about what I was saying, and thanked me for it, because there were things that they had been saying themselves, but they were perhaps not in the position that I was in to actually to say it to the whole industry. But there was a sense of despair at the status of the industry and what their governing body had been doing. And a lot of them have given up hope with RIBA. Their membership numbers have declined. And I understand that why there isn't kind of faith. One of the things that disappointed me is, I understand that the reason why the former head of diversity at RIBA, Marsha, left was she felt that the change that she was advocating for wasn't supported by the RIBA hierarchy, that they weren't prepared to take seriously the kind of diversification of the industry. So she felt that she had no choice but to resign. That's what I understand. And that is incredibly disappointing. So I think in terms of RIBA, firstly, I don't understand why any architects volunteer themselves to sit on RIBA councils, because if they generally think that is the way to bring about change, then why hasn't any meaningful change happened over the last decade? My advice to anyone that sits on RIBA councils is you're more likely to bring about change, you're more likely to put pressure on RIBA to change by resigning your positions. Now, if they would collectively resign their positions until there was meaningful change, then that is more likely to succeed. The power within RIBA sits not with those voluntary councils, but with the RIBA board. And from what I've been told and understand, the RIBA board is not committed to change. So until the leadership on the board changes, there's no realistic chance that the governing body is going to modernise and reflect what the members are saying to me that they want. And the only way there can be pressure on RIBA to change is if the architects themselves stop becoming members of RIBA and resign their positions from the councils.
That's easy for me, I never started, but we are a RIBA charter practice, but it's hard, you need it for the legitimacy. Imagine trying to appoint an architect who's not RIBA chartered.
You don't need it to work in Ealing. When we're procuring architects, that isn't a primary consideration of mine.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but there's definitely a risk that it's true. It's a bit like GCSEs. No one's ever asked me if I've got them, but like you see them anyway.
But whilst I understand there's a risk, but doing nothing is riskier. Continuing to acquiesce in the deterioration of your once great profession is far more dangerous than continuing to preserve the status quo.
We have an new incoming RIBA president, and he's absolutely advocating for change. So we'll see how much power the president wields in the next 2 years.
Yeah, from what I've been told, the power doesn't sit with the president.
No, I agree. But the outgoing president has come out and defended the Part 1 course and the way the education system is already set up. And I just think the son of an architect, who's a white guy, director of a company, whose dad was an architect,
very large practice.
A very large practice. Of course, he can't understand a perspective of somebody outside of the industry going, how does this work for me? I can see how it works for him to defend the status quo, but I can't see how it works for anybody else to defend the status quo.
Yeah, in terms of the level of research I put into in my speech, etc., I said it's 30, 40 hours of research. I took the time to listen to the inaugural speech of the current RIBA president, and nowhere in that speech did the current president talk about the lack of diversity in industry. It wasn't a feature, it hasn't, of a speech, and from what I can gather and what I've been told, it hasn't been a feature of his tenure as president.
For us, I think the change you want to see is the change you've got to make yourself, because I don't think they're going to help. So I think every architect should be trying to do that. We're doing some partnerships with other architects, so other smaller practices, so GPAD, Rickard Richards, and trying to do the bits that we can do, that we can control ourselves.
And one of the bits you can do is stop the race to the bottom.
Yeah.
That's, at the moment, that's what's been happening over the last so many years, is that architectural practices have been involved in a race to the bottom on fees.
Yeah, no, I agree, but we're a young growing practice, so sometimes all we've got to fight with is fees, but it's a tough industry that you find yourself in. But I'm going to wrap this up because this has been a fascinating chat, but we've almost done an hour, and it is Friday and afternoon and the sun's shining. Thank you so much for your time. It's been really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Cheers.
If you enjoyed the show, then please subscribe and give us a review, ideally a 5-star one. And if you want to know more, please go to ackroydlowry.com or follow us on Twitter @ackroydlowry and Instagram with the same. This podcast supports Land Aid, the property industry charity that brings together the sector to deliver life-changing projects for young people who really need it. Visit www.landaid.org to find out how you can help end youth homelessness.